think my comment will be a little bit of a departure from, not necessarily qualitatively, but in terms of focus. When I first heard or saw the polls in August that said that the DPJ was doing so well, I was really very surprised. Perhaps I hadn't been paying enough attention. I wasn't very enthusiastic about Mr. Osso with the slight twitch of his lips and his predecessors, because they were not people of very high stature, as some previous LDP leaders were, and even some were who didn't become prime minister during this very recent period. But I didn't think, I knew many things were going on in Japan. We're going to mention a couple of them in a second. But I just was very surprised. And I want to mention to all of you who are nice enough to come to see us today a little bit about the LDP historically, very quickly. The LDP was, and I'm sure in some cases still is, a machine party. An unusually developed machine party. And what I mean by this is that every member of Parliament had what they called legs down into their constituency. And these legs reached ordinary people, but they also reached members of local town, village, or city councils, members, of course, for the LDP of prefectural assembly, and so on. These were clubs, if you will, cliques. I call them machines because they were aiming to move something that reached down into the electorate in the single-member districts, which earlier in just a decade back were the main, or well, a little more, were the main districts in which people were elected to Parliament. And I thought, what can have happened to this? You know, people are changing, aging. Some cases, sons took over the machine. Some cases, a few cases, daughters took over the machine, and so forth. And I thought, gee, the DPJ is doing so well, the LDP hasn't looked so good at the top, but you know, what's happened? And I started looking at population statistics, and specifically the distributions of types of households, which is figure 8.1. And very quickly, you'll see that the colors, if you start from the bottom, at the bottom of the towers, if you will, and then read horizontally, the bottom hunk is married couples with children. You can see that they were 39.9% in '85, and they dropped to 29.9% 20 years later. You see that the very next, very skinny brown, I guess it is, slice is the percentage of the total households, I should have said that, we're talking about households, that are couples with parents. And above that in white you see, and this is easier to see, couples with parents and children. Well, in my mind, couples with parents and children, and to some extent the other two, are the kinds of households which used to prevail in Japan in rural areas and also in cities, including the very important so-called downtown areas, Shitamachi, which is where the very small home-owned industrial establishments exist. And these are not people who move a lot. They have a house and a business in the same location. And the household characteristics follow as time passes. We're looking above the line now at the green group, and now we can, I think, move up a little more quickly. We see that the green group, and let me back up, and you can see that this stable, anchored household types are shrinking as a proportion of all the households in Japan at given times. And to make this move a little faster, above, starting with the green line and then moving up to the reddish pinkish area, we're looking at married couples with no children, single mothers with children, and single males or single women. And you see that the proportions of these people in the total numbers of households in the country is increasing, corresponding to the decrease of what I'm describing, as traditional, stable, anchored types of households. I mention this because these communities, there's a wonderful book, by the way, called Village Tokyo that dispels the idea that the LDP only did well in rural areas and that the kinds of community life and local political machinery and so forth only exist in rural areas, because in Village Tokyo you see it existing in rural areas. Anyhow, these stable household types lived in the kinds of communities where the LDP local and national politicians had lives. So what I want to suggest, and by the way, looking at these data, which are only 1985 to 2005, if you extend it on back to 1970 or 65 to look at the fives, you'll see that there's been this very big, very slow change in the household structure of Japan. And I believe that this change, on one hand, has removed a lot of people from easy access by the LDP in their efforts to organize local communities of people. Because when I'd be able, it's hard to trace these things, and some of this, one particular ministry does this, and there's work on households, and they really don't get into distinguishing between young households, middle-aged households, and older households, who could be very different kind of people if we were talking about singles particularly, and I went off to their statistical shop, and they don't show any inclinations really to do that, which I think is important. But anyhow, I believe the household structure of Japanese society, which supported these candidate machine, these ladders, these stacks of local, piling up to a national machine of individual members of parliament of the LDP, are dwindling slowly. And on the other hand, I believe the potentially very mobile singles, women with kids, and I'm slipping something here, and married couples without children are less accessible because they are types of people who are not anchored in the local Stamati downtown or rural areas in the way these others typically are. And how do I say, by the way, that these things are going on? I glean when I can from anthropological studies. The Village Tokyo is an anthropological study, and I've also talked with its author, and also nosed around an awful lot trying to put some of these things together. I believe also that this structure very interestingly fits the sources of malaise in Japan just before the election. Because the sources of malaise were part-time work, more part-time work for lower wages. Probably I'm starting to tire a little bit here. A very sharp decline in savings of households, and particularly in these single-member households that we talked about, the households and also women with children and so forth. Sharp decline in actual savings, not the aggregate savings of Japan, which is very high internationally, but the savings of individual household types.